The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to Bronx Talk. In February, we did a program about the redistricting of New York State's congressional and state legislative districts. At the time, both experts on our program agreed that this was a highly flawed process that came up with, shall we say, questionable districts based on political favoritism by Democrats. In fact, after a Republican lawsuit challenged those boundary lines, a judge ordered them to be redrawn. And now, after a special master did the job and it was approved by the courts, we're left with new lines for congressional and state senate districts and two dates for New York's primaries, the Assembly and gubernatorial primaries on June 28th and the congressional and state senate primaries on August 23rd. So tonight we're back to revisit not only the redistricting process, but what the districts look like, who won and who lost in this process, and how will the new lines affect voters, and maybe even also take a look at suggestions on how to revise the process so this confusion never happens again. So please join me in welcoming back to Bronx Talk the Senior Counsel of Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law, Mr. Michael Lee. Mr. Lee, nice to have you, sir.
Yeah, thanks for having me here.
The Director of Public Policy at Citizens Union is Ben Weinberg. Mr. Weinberg, nice to have you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
And the editor of the People in Power Desk, which is appropriately named for this program. He's at Gothamist, WNYC. People know him in the Bronx as the former editor of the Norwood News. It is David Cruz. Nice to have you with us, Mr. Cruz.
Thanks for having me on, Gary.
Let's start with you, Mr. Lee. Back in February on this show, you expressed concern that having the process fall to the Democratic-controlled legislature was bound to produce gerrymandered lines. And well, now we've had the new lines drawn by a special master. Do you think that this special master, Jonathan Servas, who is a Carnegie Mellon fellow, do you think he did a good job?
Well, I think if you look at it from an objective standard in terms of the partisan fairness of the maps, these maps are much fairer in terms of partisanship, particularly the congressional map, than the map that was drawn by the Democratic legislature, which is not to say that everyone is going to be happy with every aspect of these maps. You know, the special master had to unwind a fairly aggressive gerrymander, and in doing so, he had to make choices. And not everyone's preferences probably were met in that, and you've heard a lot of griping about, you know, the outcome of the map, but, you know, in terms of the maps overall, I think they're a reasonable result among the range of possible reasonable choices. It, of course, would have been much better if the political process had produced maps, because that would have been a better way to balance out the various competing interests and concerns and produce a map that satisfied more people. But, you know, in terms of the objective of meeting the Constitution's requirement that these maps not favor incumbents, that they not favor a political party, these maps do that.
There were a number of conflicts, so to speak, and you said, yeah, not everybody's going to be happy. I thought that setting up a confrontation between two veteran congressional Democrats, both well entrenched in Congress, Jerry Nadler and Carolyn Maloney, to me, that was one step overboard, and I'm not playing politics with it. I just think that's kind of a direct statement that we're going to eliminate one veteran Democratic congressman. What do you think about that?
Well, I definitely think that is one of the complaints that has been most loudly voiced, the joining of the Upper East Side with the Upper West Side. You know, on some levels that makes sort of sense. They are despite what people will say, like neighborhoods that have probably more in common with each other than many other neighborhoods in New York have with each other. On the other hand, it does pit two incumbents together. Now, Congressman Nadler could have run in his new district, in his existing district, which now is further south in Manhattan. And for Congress, you don't have to live in your congressional district, so he could have run in a district that didn't include the Upper West Side, and he probably would have won that district. That's the district that Mayor de Blasio and others are running in right now. If he had chosen to run in that district, that certainly could have been possible for him to do well, but he chose instead to run in what is now the New York 12th against Congresswoman Maloney, and that is that's probably one of the more epic battles that we'll see this cycle. On the other hand, the New York Constitution does say that you can't draw a map to favor an incumbent, and it's hard to take a look at the old map and say that it wasn't designed to sort of protect Jerry Nadler, and that I think for the special master was a problem.
I guess it was. One last question for you, and then I'm going to ask Mr. Weinberg the same question. All over the country, and you're probably more familiar with this than I am, but you read about other states. These maps are gerrymandered all the time in other states. I don't want to say that we were penalized in New York State, but in other words, we had to draw up. New York had to draw up fair maps because we had allegedly a court system that kind of works, even though it was a Republican judge that originally. We could start breaking it down. So do you think New York is kind of unique in that way? Because really, let's face it, I just read about Florida's gerrymandering. I mean, they're just eliminating, voters of color with a swipe of a pen. In New York, that stuff wouldn't stand.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Like not only Florida, but states like Texas and Georgia, where you have very aggressive gerrymanders, largely accomplished at the expense of communities of color, right? And those maps will stand because their courts are unlikely to intervene in the way that the Court of Appeals did in New York to order the maps redrawn. And that is, we don't have a level playing field in terms of what happens. And that's in part because, it's in part because the federal courts, the U.S. Supreme Court said there is no claim for partisan gerrymandering under the U.S. Constitution, and in part because Congress failed to pass national standards. They had that opportunity with the Freedom to Vote John Lewis Act, but they didn't, and because they don't, we have a very unlevel playing field, and some states will get away with stuff that others couldn't.
You reflected exactly what I was thinking. Mr. Weinberg, what do you make of that? Are we fortunate or unfortunate in New York? Unfortunate that we had this very difficult, very partisan fight, and then in the long run, it turned out that it's probably right that we do it this way, even though it's kind of created a ton of confusion for voters. What do you think?
Well, I think we're unfortunate that there is no solution from Washington, D.C., from Congress, and there's no kind of federal across-the-board solution for redistricting and voting rights and other democracy issues. As Michael has mentioned, unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court kind of left it for every state to decide its own redistricting rules. I will say that the one thing that is, I think, often overlooked in the discussion of kind of blue states versus red state and how they redistrict is that in a state like New York, redistricting is not only about how it impacts the composition of the House and the control of Congress, as important as it is, and obviously that gets all the attention with the media or the public. But many times, and in fact, most times in a state like New York, redistricting is about what wing of the party or what candidates gets the nomination of the party. In other words, in most districts, whether it's Congress, state Senate, or Assembly, it's a question of who will win the primary, who has a shot at winning the primary. So I will say that even if you're a diehard blue Democrat or if you're a left progressive Democrat, you should want to get, even if you want to get back at Republicans, you should seek to have checks and balances and some fairness in the redistricting process. Otherwise, it is manipulated by the people in power to hurt not only the minority party, but also just anyone outside the power center within the majority party.
I think a lot of people could appreciate what you're saying because really what you're talking about is a foundation of real democracy. And with the dialogue in this country, across the country, in New York and everywhere else, we seem to be getting further away from that. Citizen Union put out a release saying that 2 primaries should be condensed to 1 in August. And I believe it was the League of Women Voters that said, you know what, the heck with all of that, let's do it the way we used to do it and put them all in September. How will the fact that, that's a nice idea, it's not going to happen now. How will the fact that we have the 2 primaries affect voters and affect voter turnout?
Yeah, so that's one of the most unfortunate outcomes of this redistricting chaos. We currently have a June primary for statewide positions, assembly positions, judicial positions, and party positions. And then we have a separate August primary only for the congressional districts and the state senate districts. Now that we know for decades now, we know that recurrent elections reduce turnout. Voters are kind of oversaturated at that point by campaigns, by ads, by political discussions. They sometimes feel like they've done their civic duty in the first election. So we have ample data going back decades on the fact that multiple elections are not in our best interest. Not to mention the fact that they increase costs. Those costs will be will have to be absorbed by local counties, and they burden election officials, campaigns, obviously voters. In New York, we've had 2 primaries in June and in September for a number of years, and we consolidated them. And then we had runoffs in New York City and primaries, and we canceled them as well through the implementation of ranked choice voting. And that was because we realized that 2 primaries or 2 elections, one after another, is bad for turnout, is bad for democracy. The moment the Court of Appeals issued its decision and disappointedly allowed this bifurcated primary season, that moment the legislature should have postponed all primaries to August. It's just disappointing that they have not done that very basic and simple solution, and I leave it to others to guess why they haven't done that.
I want to put up a quote. Obviously, there have been commentaries coming from everywhere. I thought this was particularly poignant and something that Bronx voters could relate to from Representative Jamal Bowman. He said that the purpose of redistricting is to produce districts that better represent the true will of the people and keep communities of interest together. These new maps, unfortunately, do the opposite. These newly approved maps split low-income Black and brown communities in the Bronx, namely the Northeast Bronx, into 3 separate districts. The maps will further mute the voices of these historically underrepresented communities in New York 16, which is his district, of course, and across New York State, dilute the power of Black voters and weaken our representative democracy. And that was Congressman Bowman. So let's turn to David Cruz. And let's start there. We can talk about Congressman Bowman. He's one of the elected representatives who's going to have to look at a whole newly formed district. He really viewed it as kind of large, whatever it was, 25%, 30% of the Bronx, and then some of Westchester, and now a much less percentage of the Bronx and all of Westchester. What do you make of, let's say, what's facing Congressman Bowman right now? David Cruz.
Well, I get the sense that Bowman now obviously doesn't have that much of a major chunk of the Bronx. He was the first Black elected official representing a district that had largely that was held by Eliot Engel for many years, and he had won on sort of like being this very progressive champion and also being a Black politician reflective of the larger community that he had represented. And I think obviously there's a belief that the person who's elected should be like reflective of the dominant demographics. Yeah. And it's true. It looks like Bowman loses Co-op City, which was a major voting base for him in that area. Now it's gone to Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And it looks like actually she's gotten almost. I'm looking at the map right now.
We could put let's put the Bronx map up. Here's the Bronx map, so you can see it.
Yeah, it
clearly.
looks like she definitely gained a lot more, and obviously her gain was Jamal Bowman's loss. And I think obviously it'll help her, especially retain her seat, especially if she's challenged down the road. The district is more heavily, Democratic than the previous incarnation. So certainly, there is definitely a question to be said about whether or not like you should have, an elected official who's largely representative of
the constituency.
the district.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Let's put the map up again. Let's take a look now. This is, it was kind of established in the last go-round that the 15th district, which is Richie Torres's congressional district, will now snake all the way up. It had that in the previous go-round. And that's just kind of an interesting concept that he will be representing largely part of Riverdale. But I thought it was interesting that Adriano Espaillat still seems to carry part of the Bronx, even though he's well identified with northern Manhattan. So what do you make of those two seats, the one that Espaillat holds and the one that Congressman Torres holds?
Well, we can start with Adriano Espaillat. I mean, just bear in mind that there's been a major influx within the Dominican population in the Bronx. It's actually become, I think, Dominicans outnumber Puerto Ricans now. And in that section of the Bronx, it's very clustered to, a lot of Dominican strongholds. And of course, Adriano Espaillat is the first Dominican to be, to actually ascend to Congress. And obviously, he's representing an interest from the existing constituency. Now, it looks like it was just just so happened to work in his favor, given the fact that we keep hearing the special master did not sort of like factor in incumbency. But the fact that you have Adriano Espaillat, a Dominican Congress member representing a largely Dominican base, it seems to make sense to kind of just keep that area sort of like clustered. Now, it's interesting to note too that the Bronx for years was home to the poorest congressional district. Now it's not the case anymore, given the fact that the 15th has swallowed, is now taking in what amounts to be one of the more affluent sections of the borough, which is Riverdale. Right. And it's interesting kind of to note, sort of like kind of see this dichotomy between a very poor section of the Bronx that Torres will be representing and will represent to what we'll see in 2023 when he'll, these maps will be activated and he'll likely represent that area of the Bronx. And, even going back to the days in the council, I don't think that he had really much contact with the Riverdale neighborhood, but I would say that his politics essentially aligned with Riverdale's for the most part.
He's probably seen as more centrist than others who represent the Bronx, and so maybe that makes a little bit of sense. Let's talk about the state Senate districts. Those were really changed, and we can even start with Riverdale. Let's take a look at the state Senate maps. Gustavo Rivera represents the 33rd senatorial district. And that now is going to extend way up north, also into Riverdale, which means many of the people in Riverdale will have a new Congress member and a new state senator. We can talk about Alessandra Biaggi differently. I think we have a close-up, too, of this map, so you can see the district. There it is. So what do you make of Gustavo Rivera's situation? He's going to be challenged by a candidate who was supported by the Democratic County Committee the last go-round, but now, or at least when we had the last map, but now she's going to be challenging him in the 33rd.
Yeah, this one is kind of interesting because at the moment, when you look at the filings, he does not currently live in the district he's looking to represent. And the rules within the state are that you have to live in the district that you represent. So he'll have to move or he may not run after all. And I could tell you what's interesting is the fact that, the 33rd is now going up towards the Riverdale area, which had been part of the 34th. And that was perhaps one of the more gerrymandered districts in the state. And I think, it goes all the way back to the days of Guy Villela. And, you had that little sliver in Bedford Park that had been sort of like this bridge between the two sections. And
but now so Bedford Park got unified.
It's to the benefit, I would say, to the people who are actually living there right now, because they can actually get the attention of whoever represents them on the state level.
Maybe let's put that map up again so we can see the Bronx districts. I thought it was interesting that Robert Jackson, who has never represented the Bronx in the 31st, is going to have a piece of the Bronx over there in Marble Hill and Kingsbridge. And so, it's almost a new face. And this goes back to what Mr. Weinberg was saying, that, voters really are having a hard time keeping track of what's going on. And it probably, in this day and age when everybody's so busy, going to serve to disenfranchise voters. David,
I will say,
what do you think about Robert Jackson in the Bronx?
Well, I was going to say, yeah, you're right. No one really within the Bronx knows much about him. I mean, I can tell you about these maps if they're excluding incumbency. Once again, this is a map that overlaps with the existing Dominican population in both Manhattan and the Bronx, which explains why, you see this sort of configuration. I think, yeah, if Robert Jackson decides to run, I think, he'll have to really campaign really hard if he feels that, he has a challenge within Gustavo Rivera, who's a major player within Bronx politics.
Yeah, by the way, Senator Rivera put out a statement that he was still planning to run, so if he's got to deal with his residency, that's his issue. You had suggested that he was not going to run. I don't think that's the case. Last thing I want to ask, and then we'll bring the other two back in. Alessandra Biaggi has been through the ringer, so she had decided she was going to give up her seat in the state Senate and run and represent part of the East Bronx and Long Island in the 3rd. Now she's got a very competitive race up in the 17th in Westchester, but she will no longer be representing the Bronx one way or the other.
Yeah, it's quite the gamble, I thought, for Biaggi. I feel as if, I don't know how much roots she has planted within that 17th congressional district. Obviously, we know that that's Sean Patrick Maloney's seat, and he pretty much made it clear he wants to run for that seat, and of course that seat currently belongs to Mondaire Jones. And I'm scratching my head over like whether or not she wants to take on someone who is in charge of the DCCC. So there's 2 more months for her to make her case to the constituency there, but she seems to sort of essentially make peace with the fact that she's no longer representing Riverdale.
Let's go to Michael Lee and get back to the process now. So now you've heard some of the confusion. We've heard that we may be disenfranchising voters. We know that we've been through a legal wrangle to get the maps even to where they are now. What would you, and all three of you can weigh in on this. We'll take about a minute each to do it. What would you recommend, Michael Lee? What is the next step in this process? Is it to establish a fully independent commission, which, boy, if you can find one, good luck.
Yeah, I do think fully independent commissions in states like California and Michigan did a much better job at drawing maps in terms of, both their partisan fairness and in terms of minority representation, but also in the fact that they didn't have extensive legal challenges. The maps, there always are suits about maps, but they were quickly dismissed. And, the California maps passed unanimously in a commission that had Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And, that is a much better process. I think that what happened in New York is a lesson that having courts draw maps is really volatile because you lose control of the process and you don't know what is going to come out the other end. So isn't it better to have a process that works better? And there are tons of models around the country that could be good models for that. I do worry a little bit that some people will try to gut these reforms now and try to go backwards to letting the legislature have complete control. So
I was going to ask you if you thought that the state legislature and whoever the governor ends up being has the stomach to deal with this properly, but I don't know if any of us can answer that. We certainly hope they do. Mr. Weinberg, what do you think? What's next? I know that one of the things on your plate is thinking about city council redistricting. We haven't even gotten there yet. We probably need another whole show for that. But where are we at, and what do you think conceptually needs to be done at this point?
I think at this point we need to use this opportunity to improve the system that we have now and to build on the progress that have been made in the past, but to look at the process we had this year and to fix the flaws that were in it. We need to make the commission that draws the maps more independent. They should not be directly selected by elected officials. It should be less partisan. There should be more room for unaffiliated members, independents on that commission. And it shouldn't be that easy for one side to obstruct the process. And you can do that by expanding the commission, by having an odd number of members, by making the commission agree on maps through a simple majority that would encourage consensus building. But really the most important aspect of it, in my opinion, is that the legislator should not have veto power to reject the maps outright and create its own maps instead. That really is what brought us to the situation.
David Cruz, you are the editor of the People and Power Desk, aptly named for this dialogue. What do you think the people of New York City want? What do you think they want to see? Because certainly in the Bronx, we haven't had a elected Republican in I don't know, 15, 17 years. But what do you think they would like to see as far as this process and the way their districts and voting should look like?
Well, I kind of get the sense that you're right. I think there is a lot of confusion with regards to the primary dates, and I think that can really be a turnoff when it comes to voter engagement, because there is a process. Obviously, you have to register to vote, make sure who the candidates are, and then obviously keep track of the fact that you have two primaries happening during the summer. And I think that at the end of the day, I think simplicity is essentially key, and I think that's why you saw this push to try and consolidate the primaries into one, because I think, voter turnout, as far as I can tell, can have a cascading effect down the road. If you don't vote this time around, you may not want to vote the next time around, and you just simply won't be engaged. I will tell you that the one main issue that most people care about is really just kind of learning who the candidates are at this point, because a lot of these candidates were essentially running for a given seat, and now
they're going to run somewhere else.
One candidate is no longer running in the seat anymore.
David, we got to get going. Listen, Michael Lee at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law, thank you so much. I hope next time we come and we're going to have good news and it'll be nice and simple. And also Ben Weinberg, who's the Director of Policy at Citizens Union, thank you so much. And David Cruz, who is the editor of the People and Power Desk at Gothamist, WNYC. Thank you so much for joining us. I will tell our viewers, let's go over here if we can. I will tell our viewers that we will be doing a couple of debates here on BronxNet Television. We're scheduled to do the 81st Assembly District on June 16th. Actually, we're going to record it then. You will see it then the Monday after that. And the previous week, we will do the 82nd Assembly District debate. And we're looking forward to that. We'll give you a chance to see those candidates. As we get toward the summer, we will be doing, depending on how the congressional races shape up and the state Senate races shape up, we still don't know everything about those. We will have debates as appropriate with those races as well right here on BronxNet Television, something that we have done for many years. So one last thing I just want to mention. Every week I say at the end of the show, thanks to our great producers, Rebecca and Stephen, and our director, Benaya. I want to single them out because setting this show up wasn't easy. We had to change our recording times, and they stayed with every single change. So Rebecca Hemick, Stephen Powell, Benaya War, and the whole crew up there, we thank you very much for your dedication to the people of the Bronx. And I'll tell viewers, if you can't appreciate what young, talented, smart Bronxites who want to do a good job are about, then you need to watch BronxNet Television a little more. That's what I would say. Anyway, thanks to them, thanks to our guests, and we'll see you next week.